Chapter 1. The arrival of Peregrine Roderick Clyde-Brown on Earth was authenticated by his birth certificate. His father was named as Oscar Motley Clyde-Brown, occupation solicitor, and his mother as Marguerite Diana, maiden name Ch1. Their address was the Cones, Pine Tree Lane, Virginia Water. It was also announced in the Times with the additional note, "Most grateful thanks to the staff of St. Barnabas Nursing Home." The thanks were premature, but at the time sincere. Mr. and Mrs. Clyde-Brown had waited a long time for a child and were about to resort to medical help when Peregrine was conceived. Mrs. Clyde-Brown was then 36 and her husband already 40. They were therefore understandably delighted when, after a surprisingly easy labour, Peregrine weighed in at 8 pounds 5 ounces at 6 a.m. on the 25th of March, 1960-something. "He's a beautiful baby," said the sister, with greater regard for Mrs. Clyde-Brown's feelings than for the facts. Peregrine's beauty was of the sort usually seen after a particularly nasty car accident. And such a good one. Here she was nearer the truth. From the moment of his birth, Peregrine was good. He seldom cried, ate regularly, and had just the right amount of wind to reassure his parents that he was thoroughly normal. In short, for the first 5 years he was a model child, and it was only when he continued to be a model child through his 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th years that the Clyde-Browns had cause to wonder if Peregrine was more model than was entirely proper for a small boy. "Behaviour impeccable," said Mr. Clyde-Brown, reading his school report. Peregrine went to a very expensive preparatory school as a day boy. "I find that a little disturbing. I can't imagine why. Peregrine has always been a very good boy, and I think he does as great credit as his parents. I suppose so, though when I was his age nobody said my behaviour was impeccable. On the contrary, you were an extremely naughty little boy. Your mother admitted as much." "My mother would," said Mr. Clyde-Brown, whose feelings for his late mother were mixed. "And I don't much like this tries hard against all the subjects. I'd rather his work was impeccable and his behaviour left something to be desired. Well, you can't have everything. If he misbehaved, you'd call him a hooligan or vandal or something. Be grateful he tries hard at work and doesn't get into trouble." So, for the time being, Mr. Clyde-Brown left it at that, and Peregrine continued to be a model child. It was only after another year of impeccable behaviour and hard trying that Mr. Clyde-Brown approached the headmaster for a fuller report on his son. "I'm afraid there's no chance of entering for a scholarship to Winchester," said the headmaster when Mr. Clyde-Brown expressed this hope. "In fact, it's extremely doubtful if he'd get into Harrow." "Harrow? I don't want him to go to Harrow," said Mr. Clyde-Brown, who had a conventional opinion of old Harrovians. "I want him to have the best possible education money can buy." The headmaster sighed and crossed to the window. His was a most expensive prep school. "The fact of the matter is, and you must appreciate that I've had some 30 years in the teaching profession, that Peregrine is an unusual boy, a most unusual boy." "I know that," said Mr. Clyde-Brown, "and I also know that every report I've had says his behaviour is impeccable and that he tries hard. Now, I can face facts as well as the next man. Are you suggesting he's stupid?" The headmaster turned his back to the desk with a deprecatory gesture. "I wouldn't go so far as to say that," he murmured. "Then how far would you go?" "Perhaps late developer would be more accurate. The fact of the matter is that Peregrine has difficulty conceptualizing." "So do I, come to that," said Mr. Clyde-Brown. "What on earth does it mean?" "Well, as a matter of fact, that's the 3rd time you've prefaced a matter of no fact whatsoever by using that phrase," said Mr. Clyde-Brown in his nastiest courtroom manner. "Now, I want the truth." "Well, in short, he takes everything he's told as gospel." "As gospel?" "Literally. Absolutely literally." "He takes the gospel literally," said Mr. Clyde-Brown, hoping for a chance to vent his feelings about religious education in a rational world. "Not just the gospel, everything," said the headmaster, who was finding the interview almost as harassing as trying to teach Peregrine. "He seems incapable of distinguishing between a general instruction and the particular. Take the time, for instance." "What time?" asked Mr. Clyde-Brown with a glazed look in his eyes. "Just time. Now, if one of the teachers sets the class some work to do and adds, 'Take your own time,' Peregrine invariably says, 11 o'clock. Invariably says 11 o'clock? Or whatever the time happens to be. It could be 9:30 or 9:45. "In that case he can't invariably say 11 o'clock, said Mr. Clyde-Brown, resorting to cross-examination to fight his way out of the confusion. "Well, not invariably 11 o'clock, conceded the headmaster, but invariably some time or other. Whatever his watch happens to tell him. That's what I mean about him taking everything literally. It makes teaching him a distinctly unnerving experience. Only the other day I told his class they'd got to pull their socks up, and Peregrine promptly did. It was exactly the same in Bible studies. The Reverend Wilkinson said that everyone ought to turn over a new leaf. During the break, Peregrine went to work on the camellias. My wife was deeply upset." Mr. Clyde-Brown followed his glance out of the window and surveyed the stripped bushes. "Isn't there some way of explaining the difference between metaphorical or colloquial expressions and factual ones?" he asked plaintively. "Only at the expense of a great deal of time and effort. Besides, we have the other children to consider. The English language is not easily adapted to pure logic. We must just hope that Peregrine will develop quite suddenly and learn not to do exactly what he's told." It was a sadder but no wiser Mr. Clyde-Brown who returned to the Cones. That evening, after a heated argument with his wife, whom he blamed entirely for bringing Peregrine up too dutifully, he tried to explain to his son the hazards involved in doing exactly what he was told. "You could get into terrible trouble, you know. People are always saying things they don't really mean, and if you do what they tell you, everything they tell you, you'll end up in Queer Street." Peregrine looked puzzled. "Where's Queer Street, Daddy?" he asked. Mr. Clyde-Brown studied the boy with a mixture of cautious curiosity and ill-concealed irritation. Now that it had been drawn to his attention, Peregrine's adherence to the literal had about it something of the same cunning Mrs. Clyde-Brown displayed when confronted by facts she preferred not to discuss. He had in mind extravagant use of the housekeeping money. Perhaps Peregrine's stupidity was as deliberate as his mother's. If so, there was still hope. "Queer Street is nowhere. It's simply an expression meaning a bad end." Peregrine considered this for a moment. "How can I go there if it's nowhere?" he asked finally. Mr. Clyde-Brown closed his eyes in silent prayer. He could appreciate the plight of the teachers who had to cope with this ghastly logic every day. "Never mind where it is," he said, controlling his fury with some difficulty. "What I'm saying is that if you don't pull yourself together— No, forget that. Peregrine might go into convulsions. If you don't learn to make a distinction between statements of fact and mere exhortations, you'll find yourself in deep water, in terrible trouble. Do I make myself plain?" "Yes, Daddy," said Peregrine, looking at Mr. Clyde-Brown's face with a critical eye that belied his father's hopes. But Mr. Clyde-Brown had exhausted his repertoire of clichés. "Then get out and don't do every damn thing you're told to," he shouted incautiously. Over the next few days, he came to learn the full horror of Peregrine's perverse obedience. From being a model child, Peregrine became a model delinquent. He refused to pass the marmalade at breakfast when he was told to. He came home from school with a black eye precisely because the headmaster had warned the boys against fighting. He shot Mrs. Worksop's cat with his air gun, thanks to his mother's injunction to be sure he didn't, and to make matters worse, told Mrs. Worksop by way of inverted apology that he was glad he had shot her pussy. "I can't think what's got into him," Mrs. Clyde-Brown complained, when she discovered that far from tidying his room as she had asked him, Peregrine had emptied the drawers onto the floor and had practically wrecked the place. "He's never done anything like that before. It's all most peculiar. You don't think we've got a poltergeist in the house, do you?" Mr. Clyde-Brown replied with inaudible caution. He knew only too well what they had in the house, a son with the moral discernment of a microprocessor and with an uncanny flair for misapplying logic. "Forget what I said the other day," he snarled, dragging Peregrine from his previously overfed pet rabbit, which was now starving. "From now on, you're to do what your mother and I say. I don't care what havoc you wreak at school, but I'm not having this house turned into a hellhole and the neighbour's cats shot because you're told not to. Do you understand that?" "Yes, Daddy," said Peregrine, and returned to his less disturbing model behaviour. Chapter 2. From this discovery that their son was not as other boys were, the Clyde-Browns drew differing conclusions. Mrs. Clyde-Brown stuck to her belief that Peregrine was a genius with all a genius's eccentricities, while her husband, more practically and with far less enthusiasm for the inconveniences caused by having a pubescent prodigy about the house, consulted the family doctor, Then a child psychiatrist, a consultant on educational abnormalities, and finally an expert in aptitude testing. Their findings were conflicting. The doctor expressed his personal sympathy, the psychiatrist cast some unpleasant aspersions on the Clyde-Brown's sexual life, such as it was, and the educational consultant, a follower of Ivan Ilyich, found fault with Peregrine's schooling for placing any emphasis at all on learning. Only the expert in aptitude testing had the practical advice Mr. Clyde-Brown was seeking, and gave it as his opinion that Peregrine's best future lay in the army, where strict obedience to orders, however insane, was highly commended. With this in mind, Mr. Clyde-Brown went on to arrange for Peregrine to go to any public school that would have him. Here again he had trouble. Mrs. Clyde-Brown insisted that her little sweetie pie needed the very best tuition. Mr. Clyde-Brown countered by pointing out that if the little moron was a genius, he didn't need any tuition at all. But the chief problem lay with the public school headmasters, who evidently found Mr. Clyde-Brown's desperation almost as alarming a deterrent as Peregrine's academic record. In the end, it was only thanks to a client guilty of embezzling a golf club's funds that Mr. Clyde-Brown learnt about grok-spawn, and that by way of a plea in mitigation. Since Peregrine was already 15, Mr. Clyde-Brown acted precipitately and drove up to the school during term time. Situated in the rolling, wooded hillside of South Salop, grok-spawn was virtually unknown in academic circles. Certainly Oxford and Cambridge claimed never to have heard of it, and what little reputation it had seemed to be limited to a few agricultural training colleges. "But you do have a good army entry," Mr. Clyde-Brown inquired eagerly of the retiring headmaster, who was prepared to accept Peregrine for his successor to cope with. "The war memorial in the chapel must speak for our record," said the headmaster with mournful diffidence, and led the way there. Mr. Clyde-Brown surveyed the terrible list and was impressed. 633 in the first war and 305 in the second, said the headmaster. "I think there can be few schools in the country which have contributed their all so generously. I put our record down to our excellent sports facilities, the playing fields of Waterloo and all that." Mr. Clyde-Brown nodded. His hopes for Peregrine's future had been vitiated by experience. "And then again, we do have a special course for the overactive underachiever," continued the headmaster. "Major Featherington, M.C., runs it, and we found it a great help for the more practically endowed boy whose needs are not sufficiently met on the purely scholastic side. Naturally, it's an extra, but you might find your son benefited." Mr. Clyde-Brown agreed privately. Whatever Peregrine's needs were, he was never going to benefit from a purely scholastic education. They passed along the chapel cloisters to the back of the squash court and were greeted by a volley of shots. A dozen boys with rifles were lying on the ground, firing at targets in a small-bore rifle range. "Ah, Major," said the headmaster to a dapper man who was slapping a swagger stick against highly polished riding boots. "I'd like to introduce Mr. Clyde-Brown, whose son will be joining us next term." "Splendid, splendid," said the Major, switching his swagger stick to his left arm and shaking Mr. Clyde-Brown's hand, while managing almost at the same time to order the boys to down rifles, unload, remove bolts, and apply pull-throughs. "Your boy a keen shot?" Very," said Mr. Clyde-Brown, remembering the incident with Mrs. Worksop's cat. "In fact, I think he's quite good." "Splendid. Having pulled through, apply an oily rag." The boys followed his instructions and oiled barrels. I'll leave the Major to show you round," said the headmaster, and disappeared. Presently, when rifles had been inspected and the little column moved off to the armoury, Mr. Clyde-Brown found himself being taken on a conducted tour of the assault course. A high brick wall with ropes hanging down it was succeeded by a muddy ditch, more ropes suspended from trees across a gully, a barbed wire entanglement, a narrow tunnel half filled with water, and finally, built on the edge of the quarry, a wooden tower from which a tight wire hawser slanted down to a stake some 30 yards away. "Death slide," explained the Major. "Put a toggle rope in water so it won't burn, loop it over the wire, grasp firmly with both hands, and away you go." Mr. Clyde-Brown peered nervously over the edge of the rocks some 50 feet below. He could see exactly why it was called a death slide. Don't you have a great many accidents?" he asked. I mean, what happens when they hit that iron stake at the bottom?" "Don't," said the Major. "Feet touch down first, and they let go. Put them through parachute landing technique first. Keep knees supple and roll over on the left shoulder." "I see," said Mr. Clyde-Brown dubiously, and refused the Major's offer to try it himself. "Then there's rock climbing. We're very good there. Lead boy goes up first and fixes the guide rope, and after they've had some training, we can get a squad up in 2 minutes." "Amazing," said Mr. Clyde-Brown. "And you've never had an accident?" "Couple of broken legs once in a while, but they get that anyway on the rugger field. In fact, I think it's fair to say that the boys taking this course are less likely to do themselves an injury than inflict some pretty nasty ones on other people." They went into the gym and watched a demonstration of unarmed combat. By the time it was over, Mr. Clyde-Brown had made up his mind. Whatever else Groxbourne might fail to provide, it would guarantee Peregrine's entry into the army. He returned to the headmaster's study well content. "Right, well, I think we'll put him in Mr. Gladstone's house," said the headmaster, as Mr. Clyde-Brown took out his cheque-book. "Marvellous with boys, Gladstone, and as for fees, I'll pay in advance for 3 years." The headmaster looked at him quizzically. You wouldn't rather wait and see if he finds our atmosphere suits him?" But Mr. Clyde-Brown was adamant. Having got Peregrine into what approximated to a public school, he had no intention of having him expelled. "I've added £1,000 for the chapel restoration fund," he said. "I noticed you're making an appeal." And having written out a cheque for £10,000, he left in an ebullient mood. He had been particularly heartened to learn that the overactive underachievers course extended into the summer holidays when Major Featherington took the group to North Wales for a spot of mountaineering and cross-country compass marching. "It'll give us a chance to get away on our own," Mr. Clyde-Brown thought happily as he drove south. But this was not the argument he used to persuade his wife, who had learned from a friend that Groxbourne was the last school she'd send her son to. "Elspeth says it's a brutal place, and the boys are nearly all farmers' sons, and the teaching is appalling." "It's either Groxbourne or the local comprehensive." "But there must be other schools." "There are, a great many, but they won't take Peregrine. Now, if you want your son to mix with a lot of teenage tarts at the comprehensive, you've merely to say the word." Mrs. Clyde-Brown didn't. It was one of her most ingrained beliefs that only the working class sent their children to comprehensives, and Peregrine must never be allowed to pick up their deplorable habits. "It seems such a shame we can't afford a private tutor," she whined. But Mr. Clyde-Brown was not to be deflected. "The boy has got to learn to stand on his own 2 feet and face up to the realities of life. He won't do that by staying at home and being mollycoddled by you and some down-at-heel unemployable posing as a private tutor." A remark which said as much for his own view of the world's awful reality as it did for his apparent conviction that Peregrine had spent the first 15 years of his life standing on other people's 2 feet or perched on one of his own. "Well, I like that," said Mrs. Clyde-Brown with some spirit. "And I don't," continued her husband, working himself up into a defensive fury. "If it hadn't been for your insistence on bringing him up like a china doll, he wouldn't be the idiot he is now. But no, it had to be Peregrine do this and Peregrine do that, and don't get your clothes dirty, Peregrine. Come to think of it, it's a wonder the boy has half a mind to call his own." In this he was being unfair. Peregrine's peculiarities owed as much of their bias to his father as to his mother. Mr. Clyde-Brown's career as a solicitor with court experience disposed him to divide the world up into the entirely innocent and the wholly guilty, with no states of uncertainty in between. Peregrine had imbibed his rigid ideas of good and bad from his father, and had had them reinforced by his mother. Mrs. Clyde-Brown's social pretensions and her refusal to think the worst of anyone in their circle of acquaintances, all of whom must be nice because the Clyde-Browns knew them, had limited the range of the entirely good to Virginia Water and the entirely bad to everywhere else. Television had done nothing to broaden his outlook. His parents had so severely censored his viewing to programs that showed cowboys and policemen in the best light, while redskins and suspects were shown in the worst, that Peregrine had been spared any uncertainties or moral doubts. To be brave, truthful, honest, and ready to kill anyone who wasn't was to be good. To be anything less was to be bad. It was with these impeccable prejudices that he was driven up to Groxbourne and handed over to Mr. Gladstone by his parents, who showed truly British stoicism in parting with their son. In Mr. Clyde-Brown's case, there was no need for self-control, but his wife's feelings expressed themselves as soon as they had left the school grounds. She had been particularly perturbed by the housemaster. "Mr. Gladstone looked such a peculiar man," she whimpered through her tears. "Yes," said Mr. Clyde-Brown brusquely, and refrained from pointing out that any man prepared to spend his life trying to combine the duties of a zookeeper, a prison warder, and a teacher to half-wits could hardly be expected to look normal. I mean, why was he wearing a monocle in front of a glass eye? Probably to save himself from seeing too clearly with the other one, said Mr. Clyde-Brown enigmatically, and left her to puzzle over the remark until they got home. I just hope Peregrine is going to be happy, she said, as they turned into Pine Tree Lane. If he isn't, I want you to promise me he'll go to the comprehensive school, said Mr. Clyde-Brown, and put an end to the discussion.